So, we're going to start this off with a quick question. How many countries that are around today do you all think were part of the British Empire at some point? You just raise your hands if you have an idea, a number. Yes?
14?
14, okay. Any? Yes.
52.
52, okay, well you're not far off. So the number is around 60. That may not seem like a lot, it may seem like a lot, but if it didn't, if you consider that there are only 196 countries in the world, then if you do some math, that means that the countries in the world were at one point, no, hang on, the third of all countries in the world were at one point part of the British Empire. That's a fair amount of countries. Now, the British Empire was the largest empire to ever exist. And in their height, in the 1920s, their empire stretched across 6 continents. They had possession of around a quarter of the world's land, and around a fifth of the world's total population. No other empire or country can ever match these claims. But this raises a question. How did they do it? How did they rise above their other European counterparts and become the most dominant country on the planet? I mean, they had enemies. They had the Spanish Empire that was fairly powerful. They had the French, which were nothing to be trifled with. Even the Dutch were better than them at some point. So how'd they do it? Well, they did it with they had 3 major advantages. The first one being their military, and how they were very quickly able to adapt to new ideas. The second one being their colossal trade network, and their advantages in that. And thirdly, the way the Protestant Reformation affected their empire in the early days. And this would all equal the British Empire. Now, we're going to start by looking at how the Reformation affected their colonization and their government in their infancy. To do that, we have to go all the way back to the beginning. But before we talk about it, we have to be all on the same page about what the Reformation was. So, the Reformation started around 1517, when Martin Luther sent his 95 Theses to the Catholic Church. And it was basically a letter saying everything which he felt like they were doing wrong and how they could do it right. The Catholic Church didn't really like being told what to do, and they considered he was wrong. And skipping through a lot of history, basically this is how the Reformation started, with the Protestants siding with Luther and the Catholics siding with the Pope. And they didn't really like each other. They said some mean things to each other, like, here's some Protestant propaganda of the Pope there riding the 7-headed beast from the Bible, which is like a demon. And the Catholics responded with their own propaganda of Martin Luther cooking stew with the devil. So they didn't really like each other. But how did it get to Britain? Well, it got there via that man by the name of Henry VIII. He wanted to divorce his wife. And being the monarch of England at the time, he needed permission from the Pope. So he asked the Pope. The Pope denied his request, and so Henry decided to, hey, I can do this without you. So he created his own church and separated from the Pope and created the Church of England. But it wasn't officially recognized as an actual church until Elizabeth I was put as its head. Now, this is all a very, very brief overview of the Protestant Reformation. I mean, as you can see by this very accurate graph, I am skipping over a lot. But we're not here to talk about the Reformation. We're here to talk about how it affected Britain. And it affected it in 2 major areas. The first was in the... That's there. The first was in the government. So it affected the government in 3 ways. 1, it created different political parties. During the Reformation, there were several different ideologies kind of bouncing around, and in Britain, these took the forms of political parties. And in Britain, they were the Whigs and the Tories. The Whigs were very pro-Protestantism and believed that all Catholics deserved nothing and should go somewhere else. The Tories, on the other hand, believed that the Catholics deserved the same rights as their Protestant counterparts, but the Tories by no means were pro-Catholic. They still supported Protestantism. Now, having all these political parties in the government and in London created interesting things happened. Like the Whigs would often hold ceremonies where they would burn effigies of the Pope. And being a citizen, you'd probably want to know what was going on in your government. And this would result in the second point. It created the first widespread newspapers. Before the Reformation, there was only one newspaper-esque thing. It was like a pamphlet that was heavily regulated by the government and only printed in London. But then after the Reformation, all of a sudden, newspapers were popping up not only in London, but all across the country, and even eventually in the colonies. And this would allow people to be more informed and generally make people happier. And finally, the third effect it had on the government, or major effect it had on the government, was it established the British Parliament as an actual thing. Before the Reformation, the Parliament kind of acted as like a guidance council for the king, but didn't have as much power as they do now. But after King James I and II, who both told it not to do anything and to go away, the people decided, hey, the Parliament should be able to keep the king in check. And so when William of Orange dethroned King James II, he put laws in place that would allow the government to allow the Parliament to keep the king in check. And these rules and guidelines can kind of be seen today in the American government system, which is where America took several ideas from the way the Parliament behaved. Now, the other area where the Reformation affected Britain most was in their colonization. And in their colonization, the first thing it did was it acted as a catalyst for British colonization. When Britain saw their Catholic rivals, like the French and the Spanish, being to colonize the New World, being North America and South America, they knew they had to keep up with them in order to maintain a status quo of power. And so they did. And in fact, the first two major colonies in Newfoundland and Roanoke Island were actually schemes by the British Empire to undermine Spanish colonial power in the region. The other thing the Reformation did was it allowed British colonies to be able to sustain themselves quicker. During the reign of King James I and II, who were both very pro-Catholic, they made it very challenging for the Protestants in the country to worship the way they felt like they should. And this led to a lot of them leaving the home islands in favor of the colonies, where the king could not really tell them what to do. An example of this can be when the Pilgrims left Britain to go to America. Now, this was an advantage because, compared to the French and Spanish, who were having small families or small communities going out to their colonies, Britain would have these large-scale communities that were all invested in one another and all cared about each other, that would all go to form new colonies, which just allowed British colonies to get on their feet a little quicker. Now, having colonies all across the world is good. It's essential for having a colonial empire. But you need money to finance all of this. You need money to finance your military. You need money to finance your colonial ventures. And Britain did this through trade. And they had two specific trade advantages. They had two monopolies. The first monopoly was on the tobacco trade. When Britain first came to North America, they realized that the French and Spanish were finding tons of gold and silver everywhere. And they wanted some of this gold and silver. But they didn't find any. And they got sad. But then, they discovered that tobacco grew amazingly well in their colonies. So well, in fact, that the British government told all their farmers in the homeland to cease all tobacco production in favor of growing it in the New World. Tobacco was so important to the colonists that they would often use it as a form of currency, since it always had a stable relation between gold and silver. In 1760, the tobacco trade was making Britain around 60,000 pounds per year. This may not seem like a lot now when you do some math. That number works out to the modern day equivalent of $29 billion per year. And I also converted it into dollars for us Americans. Now this is a fair amount of money, and Britain was very happy about this. But then, something bad happened. Then the American War of Independence came, and with that, Britain lost their tobacco fields. And they needed to find a new way to pay for all their expenses. They did this through the opium trade, which is their second monopoly. Opium is harvested from the opium poppy, which is primarily grown in Afghanistan and India, and back during the time of the British Empire, they had control of Afghanistan and India, and they made sure to make a fair amount of money off of this trade. And they needed to, for Britain had a problem. They were addicted to something, something that only the Chinese could provide. They were addicted to tea. They were so addicted to tea, in fact, that they almost went bankrupt at one point by how much tea they were buying from the Chinese. So they needed a way to pay for all this tea, and they did it via the opium trade. In the 1850s, 1 ton of opium was valued at 20 million silver dollars. It's a fair amount. That's right there. When the opium trade in China first began, in around 1729, Britain was selling China around 200 chests of opium per year. But in the course of around 150 years, that number would go all the way up to around 60,000 chests per year in 1860. And that number would continue to rise until China was able to officially stop the trade in 1917. Now, China tried to stop the trade beforehand. They tried hard in 1840s and 1850s, because around that time there were 12 million opium addicts in China. Now, this was good for Britain. They were very happy about this because it meant they had a constant demand. But the Chinese government didn't like it, and they tried many times to stop it. And one time they confiscated a lot of British opium, around 1 ton, and burned it all in defiance, and they closed their ports to British trade. Britain responded by sending their navy up to try to talk some sense into the Chinese. The Chinese responded to that by declaring war on Britain, and thus followed the 4-year conflict known as the Opium War. China lost because they were using bows and arrows and swords, compared to Britain using cannons and rifles, so it didn't go so well for them. But they tried again 10 years later and declared war on Britain again. And they lost again for pretty much the same reason. But as I said earlier, they would eventually be able to stop it in 1917. But the story of the Opium Wars is actually interesting, because what happened there was Britain had an advantage over their enemies because of their military, and specifically their military technology. And this comes up again and again in the wars that Britain would fight. And this is actually the third and final point to my presentation: the British military. When you're talking about the British military, you have to discuss the Navy at least once. So I'm just going to quickly go over the Navy. There are 2 major benefits to having the world's largest Navy, besides being able to beat anybody in a naval battle. One was giving them control of the seas, which basically meant they could say who got to go when, where, and why. And they also had control of trade routes, so if a country was acting up, Britain could just kind of sever the trade routes, and the country would typically start listening to Britain. But enough about the Navy. The first technological innovation that Britain had was the machine gun. In 1860s and 1870s, there were really no machine guns except for this machine gun-esque machine created by the American Dr. Richard J. Gatlin, and it was named the Gatlin gun. But this wasn't a true machine gun, for it required a crank in order to load the next shots, and this would not allow a continuous rate of fire. However, his designs would inspire the British engineer Hiram Maxim to invent his weapon, the Maxim gun. There's a theme here with naming things. You name them after yourself. But he invented the Maxim gun, and this was the true machine gun, for it utilized a new and revolutionary idea, which was using the recoil of the previous shot to load the next, thus resulting in a continuous rate of fire. The British government was very pleased with his designs, and they implemented it into the military, and it saw extensive use and was very effective. One example can be during a colonial skirmish where 700 British colonial soldiers fought off 5,000 warriors with just 4 Maxim guns. And in Hilary Bollock's book, The Modern Traveler, he wrote, "Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun, and they have not." So the Maxim gun was pretty important to the British. And it would go on to be modified and redesigned, and eventually it would turn into what we all recognize today as a modern machine gun. But it all started with Hiram Maxim and the British Empire. Now, the second and final major innovation that Britain had in military was the invention of the tank. Before Britain invented the tank in 1916, there were tank-like things. None of them really caught on. I can't imagine why. They never did. But then came World War I. And with World War I came trench warfare. And with trench warfare came a stalemate between the armies. And Britain needed a way to break the deadlock. And then this man, by the name of Ernest D. Swinton, he came along and said to the British Empire, "I have these designs for what he would have called either an armored car or an armored tractor." They didn't have the term tank yet, but we would have called it a tank. He said, "I have designs for this armored vehicle. Do you want to finance me?" The British government was a little, they weren't sure if it was going to work, so they decided not to. But then, the science committee that had been established by Winston Churchill saw his designs and were very excited and decided to finance him. But they gave him some parameters. His vehicle must be able to drive at least 4 miles per hour. That was really fast back then, by the way. It was like records. They also must be able to climb a 5-foot parapet. It must be able to cross an 8-foot gap, drive in reverse, and finally, it must be able to fight. Now, Swenton would take these designs and he would create a few prototypes, but none of them were able to meet all the requirements, until he invented what he would call Big Willie. However, when it would go into mass production, it would be referred to as the Mark IV. Now, the British government, they loved it. They were very happy with what he had invented. And they ordered 150 to be made immediately for their upcoming offensive in the summer of 1916. Now, in that battle, the tank would not prove to be the world-changing weapon that some had hoped it would, but it did prove that if used correctly, it could be very beneficial in any combat scenario. And later on in World War II, it would prove to be a very efficient and effective bit to any army. So, in conclusion, how did the British Empire become the world's largest empire? Well, they did it through their military. Having the world's largest navy didn't hurt, but they also were very willing to adapt to new technologies and ideas. Their trade financed their ambitions, especially by having 2 monopolies on tobacco and opium. And finally, the way the Protestant Reformation affected their empire in the early stages, both affecting the British government and the way they colonized, and allowing them to give something for them to drive forth and accomplish in their mission.